We're here with James Agnew, who I have known for a long time and am very jealous of his lakeside house. But we are not going to talk about that, right, James? We are going to talk about IPS generation in HAPI. So if you're ready, go ahead.
Let's do it. All right, so we're going to talk about IPS today. This is fun. We've actually got Rob, who is much more of an IPS expert than I am, sitting right in the front row. So if I screw anything up, Rob will keep me accountable. That's good. And if anyone wants to ask hard-pointed questions at the end about IPS, I could just say, ask him. I like that. So a little bit about me to start off with. I have been involved for many, many years with open source implementation of HL7 standards. I've been the project lead for the HAPI project for going almost 2 decades now, which blows my mind that I've been doing this for that long, but there we go. Started with the old HL7 v2 parser, which hopefully some people in this room know. Got involved with FHIR very early on and helped to spin up the HAPI FHIR project, which has certainly become the bigger of the two. And I always say, I mean, my primary attribute at events like this, beyond being an open source believer and an evangelist, is I'm a standards geek, and I will be for life, I'm sure. I love this world. So there we go. And this is my sidekick, Dharma. I can talk dogs if anyone wants to do that later. So originally the plan for this talk was I was going to go really, really deep on the technology. I actually tweaked it a little bit, realizing I'm on the sort of the first day, the intro day. So I decided what I would do is sort of create a bit of a blended talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about a background on IPS itself and sort of, what its purpose is and some of the use cases and stuff like that. I am going to talk about the main purpose here, which is our new API and HAPI FHIR for generating documents, because of course, we love having APIs that prove out the good concepts coming out of the bigger FHIR community. So I'm going to talk about that a bunch. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our roadmap, partly for IPS itself and where the community is going, but partly the stuff that we still want to do as a part of our open source APIs for generating those things. So that's what we're going to talk about over the course of the next 30-ish minutes. And I'm going to do my best to leave lots of time for questions, because I feel like this is a subject that tends to generate lots of questions. So first off, what is the IPS all about? The acronym, of course, International Patient Summary. I'm sure we're all familiar with that part. And I mean, the whole idea with the IPS is it's supposed to be a little sort of compact summary of all of the pertinent clinical information about a patient that would be relevant to unplanned care scenarios. I like that description. And I mean, ultimately, the use case there is, it's pretty straightforward. I mean, honestly, it's personal to me, as I'm sure it is to many of us. I see a bunch of faces in this room that I know are not from the US, and I'm one of those people. I'm from Canada. And I mean, I know well that if I were to end up in as we will euphemistically call it, an unplanned care scenario, if I were to get hit by a tram crossing the street out there, and ended up in the hospital. I mean, I know that there is no summary of my health information available in any electronic or non-electronic form to my clinicians, that would be taking care of me here. If I've got allergies, I don't have any relevant allergies that probably would be there, but I do have a metal implant in my hip. I've got an arthritic condition in my back. I'm on a bunch of medicines. And I mean, none of that information, I'm basically at the mercy of my memory. If I'm in this unplanned care scenario. So having some electronic mechanism for the relevant data to follow me around, as I need care, I can just imagine that would lead to me having better care. And I would imagine everyone here. This is a pretty easy use case to follow. Very cool one at that. So there we go. There's going to be lots of talks, I think, over the course of the next couple of days that at least touch on IPS, and certainly there'll be a deeper history that goes into it. I love this diagram. I just think it's fascinating to sort of see the relationships between all of the different entities that are involved in IPS in its various forms. The key thing that I want to stress here is IPS itself is not even a FHIR thing or an HL7 thing. The standard is bigger than that, actually. It sort of crosses a number of SCDOs who have their part in the creation of the underlying data model, the coding standards that we use there, the physical sort of capture layer, which is where FHIR comes in. There actually is a CDA version of the standard as well. So there's a whole bunch, there's different encoding formats. And I guess the idea here is that regardless of which of the various flavors you pick, you do have sort of I don't know, a cross-interoperable version of a set of data that could be used for these care scenarios. So really neat thing. I won't spend too much time on this diagram, but I like staring at it, sort of understanding the lines. Looks like a map, and us geeks like looking at maps. These are the data elements that form the IPS in its universal form. And all of this, I mean, to me, this is just all such, I don't know, such common sense stuff. I mean, you've got some headers, some metadata information about, who's the custodian of this information, who ultimately wrote the thing, who is it about, who is the subject. You've got some required sections, and these are all very common sense things. You got to have a medication summary, you got to have allergies and intolerances, you got to have a problem list. And then we have some recommended sections, and I won't read you the names of all of these things, but I think to anyone looking at this, it's visibly obvious. I mean, I'm a software developer. I'm about as far from a clinician as you could get, but it's visibly obvious to me why all of these things would be important in the unplanned care scenarios we're talking about. And I think, a couple of extra points to anyone who's thinking about implementing this in their own software. It's certainly worth mentioning that the standard is designed to be constrainable and extendable. I'm going to talk a little bit later about our efforts in Canada to come up with what we call the PS-CA, the Canadian summary, and in fact, our provincial efforts within our mini jurisdictions to constrain it even further. That's point one. And then point two is that ultimately there is, nobody is saying that just because something is required here, you have to have data there as well. So there is sort of a defined mechanism that is still a little bit in flux. I mean, we are debating exactly how to do this, but it is important that that section exists. But you could also just say, I am acknowledging this section as a part of the document, but I don't know what to put there. So, don't take, my saying there's no allergies as meaning the patient is not allergic to anything. I'm just telling you I don't know. And that is a thing that's valid to do here. I mean, this is, the absence of a bit of data in one spot doesn't invalidate the entire concept of having a bunch of good data. So that is, and this is all described in the spec as well. So there's a fair bit there. A little bit on the actual implementation in FHIR next. So I don't know how many of you guys have ever worked with FHIR documents. I mean, when you learn FHIR, and I'm sure some of you were in the intro to FHIR that happened earlier today, everybody really focuses on the RESTful paradigm because it is the coolest paradigm for FHIR. I mean, you get through the data model, you get through how to query and do search and all those good things. And this is all brand new stuff. I mean, the standards world didn't really have a good thing that the RESTful paradigm was trying to replace, which is why it took off so quickly. But FHIR has solutions to other paradigms as well. FHIR does have a format for documents. It's got a messaging format for that matter. And these are things that theoretically one day might displace things like CDA and HL7 version 2. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But I mean, these are answers using modern approaches to those legacy standards as well. FHIR documents, there's a couple of interesting things if you haven't seen one before that are worth mentioning. First off, a FHIR document ultimately is a bundle resource. So it looks in many ways just like a search result set would look. If you do a RESTful search on a server, you get back this bundle that's got a bunch of resources in it. And that's exactly what a document is as well. It's a bundle with a bunch of resources in it. But the document paradigm puts a couple of extra rules on it. And first, and really the main important rule there is that your next resource along is going to be a composition, your first resource rather, is going to be a composition resource within the bundle. And the composition resource has two sort of primary important things it does. First off, it acts as a table of contents to the document. It lays out, what are the sections of the document, and if you've got subsections, what are they, what's the order of them, what resources in the rest of the bundle are relevant. So it sort of acts as this guide to all of the structured content you've got within your document. That's thing one. And then thing two is it contains all of your narrative content. And this is critical with FHIR documents. Generally speaking, if you've ever run anything through the validator, like through the reference validator at validator.phir.org, which I've done 100 times, and I always get the same error back that says it is recommended for best practice to always have a narrative in your resources. And I know anyone who's implemented FHIR servers, you look at that one and you think, I'm not going to bother with that. And you should, but I'm not trying to discourage anyone from creating narratives, but developers being developers, we know the part that you're going to skip. With the document paradigm, though, we recognize this is doubly important. And I'm going to say with IPS, it's still further doubly important. And that is for the singular reason that unlike almost any other sort of paradigm you've got with the use of FHIR, With IPS, the expectation is that the person who is receiving your document, you have no pre-existing relationship with. You guys have not agreed on profiles you're going to exchange. You haven't agreed on a minimum data set. You've got no, like, there's really no reason to expect that you have validated the semantic interoperability of your two systems. And I mean, we'll hope that that will work. But in the case it doesn't, it is critical that you've got a narrative, just because that sort of provides this mechanism for you at a very minimum to show that to a clinician who can look at it and say, okay, at least I can read the text and I can gain some meaning out of a bunch of data that you've sent me. So super, super important to send that. And there we go. So that's how that stuff all works. I think, so this is fascinating to me. I mean, I've been involved with IPS certainly not since the start. I got dragged into this community about 2 years ago, and I think it had been going for a while before that. But I quickly got really interested in it, and I'm going to talk about the HAPI stuff soon, which is where my personal interests lie in all of this. But that first point there that I want to make is that, to me, IPS is following the exact same trajectory that the FHIR standard itself followed a decade ago. And that's it. I mean, I got involved with FHIR just over a decade ago. And just watching this trajectory with IPS has been fascinating to me. I mean, all of a sudden, like 10 years ago, you had all of these people looking at FHIR as this crazy panacea that was going to solve all the world's problems, and people were proposing it for wildly inappropriate use cases that it was never going to touch, and thinking that as long as you check the box and we're using FHIR, all of your other problems would go away. And yet you had all this excitement and all these people rushing to build stuff into their systems. And I mean, I don't mean any of this to sound negative. I mean, ultimately, people solved all kinds of crazy things with FHIR. And I mean, IPS to me is at the start of that exact same arc. We are seeing people, like, we're seeing a ton of enthusiasm. I mean, the very last Connectathon ballooned up to 5 tables, sort of 5 track tables going on for IPS. So clearly it's on a crazy ascendant arc right now. But the other side of that is, I mean, we're seeing people proposing IPS as this solution to problems that really have nothing to do with what you would ever solve with IPS. So we're in a funny spot right now, which I think is interesting, but there we go. However, I don't want, as I say, I don't want any of that to sound negative, because the positive here is that we are seeing amazing, very pertinent interest to this standard. Governments are talking about solving real-world problems with it. Vendors are showing up with the beginnings of actual software that implements the standard, which is super cool. And we're seeing a whole bunch of just really, really interesting use cases emerging out of all of this as well. I want to talk about a couple there that I think are super neat. I mean, one, I was saying in Canada, we've got a pretty good sort of set of networks across our country for health information exchanges. But one thing we don't have in Canada remotely is any kind of cross-provincial data exchange. Like if I cross what would be the equivalent of a state line here in the US to the next province over. And I'm from Ottawa, which is on one of those provincial borders. I know that I could drive 15 minutes from the place where my parents live, and there would be zero electronic access to any information about James. It just does not cross provincial borders at home. And to me, IPS is probably our first chance at solving that problem. It's a nice little implementable, compact summary of information that would be useful to follow me across a border. So I love it for that. Another one that I helped to work on last year that I just thought was super interesting. We were down in Indonesia, and in Indonesia, there's a whole lot of people that go on religious pilgrimages they do the Hajj pilgrimage, go to Saudi Arabia. And they were sort of describing to us that they send so many people that even statistically, you're going to have a proportion of those people will have heat stroke, because of course it's hot and dusty and all that stuff. And so they are actively working right now on how can they send people with little IPS documents so that if you pass out, there is a little summary of everything a clinician treating you there would need to know. So I don't know, 2 little examples of real-world problems that IPS is just a perfect fit for. I think it's pretty cool. I already said this, so I will skip that. So here's where we get to my interest. Any Canadians in the room will laugh at this picture probably. This comes from what we call the Pan-Canadian Blueprint, which was a document published over 20 years ago in Canada describing the way that we did health information exchanges in Canada. I say did, we still do it this way. There's a whole lot not to like about this picture, but the thing to like about this picture is that the model we use in Canada is we build a set of what we call domain-specific repositories. So in the province I'm from, Ontario, we've got a great big database that holds every lab test performed in the province. And we've got another great big database that holds every medical imaging report for every picture taken in the province. We've got immunization registries. We've got drug administration repositories. So we've got a bunch of these databases that are just these lovely sources of information about all of our citizens within the province, and that's a population of roughly 15 million people. So it occurred to me really early on in my personal arc with IPS that these great big domain repositories would be a really neat source of information to automatically generate an international patient summary document. Everything that I had seen at that point talked about, EMR vendors building a module that would automatically or, on demand export an IPS, and I think that's a great use case too. But with the advantage that we have in our Canadian system, and we're not the only people that work this way, but I think it's a neat example. We've got these super rich sources of really good longitudinal, fairly well-coded, fairly well-structured data about all of our citizenry. So could we use that to automatically generate an IPS document? And sure enough, we spent a bunch of time tuning and tweaking algorithms, and we came up with a way to do that. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to skip a couple of these slides because I know I'm going slower than I intended to. About 2 years ago, we got a community contribution to HAPI that was the initial version of an automatic IPS generator. It sat within HAPI FHIR. It sat on top of what we call our JPA server, which is the repository model in HAPI FHIR for building up a repository of FHIR data. And this module was this neat little system that would sort of go in and pull out a bunch of data for each of the sections in the IPS and a set of sort of what we call narrative templates. I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. These narrative templates for generating the narrative. And ultimately, it would spit out an IPS document based on a bunch of data that was sitting inside the repository. So the version that was contributed had a bunch of hard-coded rules. And the hard-coded rules were fairly straightforward. It was things like the vital signs section should include observations with a category code of vital signs, and the conditions or the problem list section should include condition resources with a status of active. Like it was simple rules like that, and they all sort of made common sense. But I got to thinking, what if we could make these rules customizable so that somebody could use these rules if they applied to them, but they could tweak them to either change the parameters or add new sections or remove sections that didn't make sense. And that was it. The very first version of our API that we launched about 2 years ago included exactly that. So it was a sort of little easy customizable version of the stuff that had been contributed by a set of community contributors to HAPI FHIR. What we've heard back in the last 2 years, and I will say this is a thing we've often done in the life cycle of HAPI, is we'll try and get something out there as fast as possible, and we'll just say, we know this API isn't perfect. We want feedback. We're going to work with the feedback. We're going to sort of tweak the API as we go. And that's exactly what we've done. So what we heard back was a couple of things. First off, what we call the inclusion API, the thing that you use to decide what resources go in your bundle. People found it a little bit convoluted and confusing, and I certainly agree it was. I wrote it over the course of a weekend and didn't think much about its usability. That's a thing that happens. Secondly, and I think more importantly, we got a bunch of feedback back that it was limiting having to take all of the data from a single repository. People wanted to be able to source data from a set of repositories. They wanted to be able to call what we call the plain server. In other words, they wanted to talk to facades. They wanted to be able to pull data out of databases that were not FHIR databases. In other words, they didn't want to be bound to a single FHIR repository, and that's fair. The third one, which didn't even occur to me at the time, but kind of makes sense, is that there was a bunch of people sort of started to feedback that it would be really nice to be able to create different profiles of IPS depending on what the requester was actually looking for. Which, I didn't totally get that, because I sort of assumed if you're doing this in the first place, you probably have a single profile that you care about. But we started seeing use cases where people wanted to produce two versions of an IPS, one that was really a short summary and one that was a much longer summary with more detail. And I can't totally speak to the, I certainly am not going to try and speak to the validity of that, but it's a real thing that people came back with. And we try not to be opinionated about what you can use HAPI for, so we've tried to address that stuff. So what we're doing, and I guess I'm roughly announcing this here today. We did announce it at our last release webinar, which was about 3 weeks ago, so this isn't the first time I've said this publicly. But We are, as of our latest HAPI FHIR release, we have completely rewritten the IPS generator, and we've launched a new API that's in some ways streamlined. In some ways, it's actually a bunch more complicated because it's a bunch more powerful as well, and there we go. Our two big goals, I mean, first off, we are trying to pivot to being completely standalone. In other words, not requiring a repository sitting underneath it. And that, I mean, that's I think a pretty big goal. We're also trying to set things up to be easier to customize because it really was pretty convoluted the way that it worked to add new sections and change the inclusion criteria before. So there we go. This is a little UML diagram of what sits inside HAPI. These are all of the players when you're trying to create one of these documents. I'm going to walk you through a couple of these, and this is the one part of this talk. We're going to look at a tiny bit of code. First off, there is one class that is the engine that drives everything. It's called IPS Generator Service, and oh god, there's a typo on there. That should say IMPL. That's what I get for not proofreading, I suppose. Anyhow, that's the generation engine. This is the one part of the solution that's actually not designed for customization itself. I mean, the intention is you use the engine, you customize everything around it, but not the engine itself. I mean, you're obviously welcome to customize it as well if you want, but it's not really designed for that. It's got two methods on it. Both of them are called generate IPS, and they roughly correspond to the $summary operation. One of them takes an ID of a patient, the other one takes an identifier of a patient, and that's the only difference between those two. And that's all I'll say about that. We've also got what's called an operation provider. This is a plain server provider, and this is the thing that you would register with your HAPI FHIR server to actually physically support the $summary operation if that's a thing you want to support in your architecture. If you're not familiar with the $summary operation, I'm sure it's a thing Rob will talk about when he has his talk. But the short version is, it is an operation, a FHIR operation that you can use on a FHIR server to request the creation of an IPS document for a specific patient. And that's about all it is, actually. And I've got a few examples of calling it there. You can give it an ID, you can give it an identifier, you can even ask for a specific profile back if you want, and there we go. On to the more interesting things. So the new API has this interface that you need to provide at least one implementation of, and it's called IPS Generation Strategy. And this, as the name suggests, is the strategy object that we will use to select the resources, to select the narrative template, to select the title, to select the profile, all of the things that we need to figure out in order to build one of these IPS documents for you. You're going to register one of these things for each profile that you wish to support within the generator. So if you're supporting two different profiles of IPS, for example, then you would register two of these strategies, one for each of those profiles. The profile has a couple of, or the generation strategy has a couple of methods that you can implement. First and foremost, well, actually this is probably the least important one, but you tell it which profile you're actually implementing based on this strategy. And what I'm showing you is sort of we provide a default implementation, so these are all default values. This is the universal profile. This is the profile URL for the universal profile for IPS. It's got another method for creating the title. This is all pretty self-explanatory stuff. You give it what title are we going to give the document. You could override that if you wanted for something more specific. This is kind of an interesting one. We've got this method called massage resource ID that allows you to, if you want, manipulate the IDs of the resource that you're putting into the bundle. And I highlight this one. There's actually a bunch more little tweaky things like that in there that you can modify if you want. And I'm not going to go through every last one of them, but I think this one is really interesting because it's contentious, actually. There is a bunch of debate within, within circles of people implementing software for IPS around IDs of resources within the bundle, I guess is what I'm saying. None of this, like, it's interesting. I mean, if you're doing the RESTful paradigm, you don't have to worry about this stuff. I mean, it's just hard-coded, like, your bundle, your search result bundle, for example, needs to have the complete address of the resource as it came back from the server. So you can always look at this resource and say, oh, I see where this came from. I can go and download the latest copy of it if I want. Within documents, there's no such requirement. There are strong opinions, and there are strong opinions on both sides, and I've heard both sides of this from lots of people who like to bring opinions to the HAPI community. Some people feel that all of your resource IDs should be GUIDs, and they should provide no traceability, and other people completely disagree with that, and I'm not here to express an opinion. I'm actually showing an example of this customized. I will say the default version, the V1 of this API used to use GUIDs. V2, Graham argued with me until I gave up and didn't want to fight him anymore, so we don't do that anymore. But if you want to, you would implement this. And there we go. You can ask Rob why this is important. I'm going to talk about something else. What was the next thing? Oh, and there we go. OK, so in the strategy, the next thing you're going to do is you're going to add a bunch of sections with this new API. And sections, basically, you're going to call this add section method once for every section you want to add to the document as you're sort of configuring the builder. And each section takes two arguments. One is this thing called the details object, which provides the metadata about the section. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. In fact, I'll show you both of these things in a second for real. And the other is what's called the resource supplier. And this is the thing that actually goes and slurps up all of the resources that we're going to include in that section of the document. I don't know, for your document. So the metadata section first. This is what we call our section builder. I think this code is all pretty self-explanatory if you're a Java developer. And if you're a C# developer, just imagine that the variable names are capitalized, and it'll look familiar to you too. Yeah, so here we go. You give it a title for the section. You give it a code for the section. You give it a profile for the section. And it's interesting to note here, the profile for the section doesn't actually appear in the document anywhere. The only reason the profile is important is because we use it to figure out which narrative generation template to use. And I'll talk about that in a minute. It is important, though, because you have to generate narratives for these things. And then you tell it what types of resources are ultimately going to appear in that section. So this is not a section of the universal IPS, but I've heard a few people in various countries talk about IPS adoption. And this is a pattern we've seen a few times, is that people want to create some sort of patient notes section where the patient can add their own data to the IPS. So this is an example of how you might add such a section. That's the metadata that goes with it. And then the other part of it is that you provide what's called a resource supplier. And yet again, I think this is pretty self-explanatory stuff. This is an artificial example. All I'm doing here is creating a hard-coded resource and returning it. And of course, you would never do that for real. You would go and look in a database or fetch data somehow. But the example is that. Like this is how you would return data from one of these resource suppliers for an individual section of the document. One thing I will draw your attention to, just because it's a little bit weird, is this notion of inclusion type, where I call this a primary resource. This is a thing that is probably the only thing that's not totally intuitive on the page. What that actually means is something is a primary resource if it is intended to be linked to from the composition directly. I don't know if you remember, I said this a few minutes ago when I was talking about what goes in the bundle. You've got a bunch of resources that are linked to from your composition resource, and those are the actual sort of structured contents of that section of the document. But you might have other resources that you want to include in the bundle because they're referenced from other resources other than the composition, and those are called secondary resources. So anytime you return one of these things, you have to tell the API, is this a primary or is this a secondary? And I even had a bullet about that. There we go. I will say as well, there is a generation strategy for JPA. So the old functionality doesn't go away. We've just made it so that you don't have to use the old functionality. And in fact, most people who are using the IPS generator, at least that I have come across with HAPI FHIR, are still using the repository model, the JPA model. So this is, we do still provide section search, what are they called? Section search strategies, which are the things that actually go and fetch data from the repository. So you can still use those. Do I have an example? No, I don't have an example of how you customize that, but there we go. So a bunch of code exists for pulling data out of the repository, and you can sort of stitch all this stuff together, however it is you want to do that. Narrative generation, I will say critically, we within HAPI FHIR for years have had a narrative generator, a thing that will generate structured HTML code based on the structured data that sits inside repositories. We use a library called Timeleaf to do that, and Timeleaf is a Java-based templating engine. I have to say I both love and hate it. It's the thing we have, so it's the thing we use here, but it's not. I find the syntax a little bit clunky, and the more complicated we try and make these templates, the more I find I'm fighting against Timeleaf. So I don't entirely love it, but it is the way we do this stuff. What you need to do ultimately, as a part of creating this, is to create a set of create this properties file that sort of is the map between your sections and their profiles and the narrative template files that go in there. And then those pointers are to Timeleaf templates. And this may well not, I'm sure that's not readable at the back. You can trust me, it's actually not all that readable at the front either. just because it is kind of a clunky format. But this is the way that we define our narrative templates. And I perhaps most importantly, I'll say, for all of the sections that are a part of the universal IPS implementation guide, we have provided well-tested working XHTML templates. Like, we've provided a bunch of narrative templates. And you can use those in your own software. I mean, you can certainly customize them if you want, but they are designed to be used. So there we go. A couple of challenges that I think I'll mention. I mean, first off, a big challenge that we've got, and I say this just because if you are trying to implement this on your own, and I recognize that probably not everyone here is a HAPI FHIR user. There's probably people with all kinds of other stacks, so you may well just be thinking, how would I implement IPS in whatever stack it is that I use? I will say that, I mean, first off, generating narratives is really, really hard. I said that our templates were well tested, and they are well tested, but they still have a ton of bugs. I mean, I guarantee you that. People are constantly telling us that they tried a summary on some random bit of data on our public testing server, and the narrative generator crashes. I actually tripped over exactly that this morning, so it's a thing that happens regularly. And I don't know, we're slowly getting better at it, but it's difficult. There's this notion of a thing called narrative links, which is, I don't know, it's a weird one. It's hard. It's been really hard for us to get right. Really neat section, which is why or really neat sort of, I don't know, thing, which is why I mention it here, allows you to create these sort of references from your structured data, or actually from your narrative template to the structured data, just so that an individual HTML element in the narrative can be cross-referenced with the structured data, the resource that we sourced to create that HTML text. Getting these things right has been super tough, just because if you try to do this for real, you start to realize you end up with duplicate narrative links in places where a resource is relevant to two sections, and the validator gets really angry about the same narrative link appearing twice. You may well not know what I'm talking about now, but trust me, if you try and do this on your own, you're going to run into that same problem, because we just keep tripping over it. Much more importantly, I'm getting sick of Timeleaf personally, and I've been saying for years now we're going to create a new narrative generator in HAPI FHIR. I've had this vision for, like, honestly, probably 8 or 9 years now, that we do one based on the Liquid templating engine instead. I'm really hoping that IPS will be the kick in the pants that finally gets us to start working on that thing, because I really, really want us to have a better, more usable, less buggy narrative generator, and I think Liquid is probably the way to go. So I don't know, watch this space. At some point we will do that. Already said that. I will say this, if you want to try this out on your own, hapi.fhir.org is our public testing server for HAPI FHIR. Pull up a patient of your choosing and try the $ summary operation, and you too can generate your own IPS document. This is an example of the immunization section from the patient with this lovely GUID. Don't try that. It's on the patient with the ID of example, because I did about an hour ago and it crashed. So there's a bug in our narrative templates that caused that crash. I mean, you can try it if you want. It doesn't crash the server, but it doesn't generate a narrative either. More importantly, if you're using what's called the JPA Starter Project, which is the place that you go if you want to start using our open source JPA server. Diego was just talking about the version of HAPI FHIR that you can get down from the tooling he was showing, and this is exactly what you get back. My voice just cut out. Anyhow. There is literally just one configuration line sitting inside the application.yaml file that you use to configure, and you just set that from false to true. You have got IPS turned on in your server, and there we go. One little side note I will say to do with all of this, I want to talk quickly about smart health links, because smart health links are unrelated to IPS, but these days they might as well be completely related to IPS, because of course, if you're talking IPS, I'm off, right? Should I just speak into this? Oh, there we go. I'll do that. All right, we're good. Okay, so if you're trying to create these IPS documents, I mean, they're really not useful unless you've got some mechanism for sharing them with a clinician. And this all of a sudden, almost out of nowhere, comes along this standard called, or at least this proposed standard called Smart Health Links. If you're not familiar with Smart Health Links, you may well be familiar with its companion standard, Smart Health Cards. If you ever had a COVID vaccine passport, what you actually probably had in your hand was a Smart Health Card. They're really neat things. They're little QR codes that are effectively a little tiny JOT, JSON Web Token. actually a JSON web signature that includes a little tiny FHIR payload and a digital signature that makes sure that the thing can't be tampered with. Very cool. They were great for the tiny bit of information that you needed in order to encode a COVID vaccination proof. But they're wildly inappropriate for smart health, for international patient summary, because of course you've got so much data in one of these things that the QR code is going to be the size of your head. So along comes smart health links, which are this beautiful little tiny protocol that embeds inside a QR code a link that you could use to go and get one of these IPS documents. And it doesn't have to be an IPS document. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but it's just a great use case. So you get a link that you could use to go and fetch one of these documents. And if somebody had an IPS-enabled EMR that understood the protocol, they could scan the QR code and download right into their EMR the IPS document. But there's also this beautiful fallback built into the protocol that allows that sort of provides a web-based viewer URL, so that if I scan this on my phone, it actually is going to work without any special software installed. It sort of will bring up a browser, and there's a bunch of demos out there. It's just magical stuff to see. So I'm not going to show you one now. I am going to close with talking about our roadmap for what we're up to. I will say this: I'm not aware of any production use today of the HAPI FHIR IPS generator. It is a fairly new API, and for that matter, of course, IPS is a pretty new specification. So I'm not aware of anyone who's doing this in production today. But I am aware of several companies at this point that are on that journey, that are currently working on tweaking our generator so that they can start rolling it out for production use. So I suspect this time next year there will be some people doing this in production, which is kind of cool. I'm not going to name anyone because none of them have given me permission to do so, but there are some really neat use cases actually, well beyond the unplanned care scenario, which I think is neat. We've also started testing some open source software for implementing the Smart Health Links standard. We haven't yet open sourced it, so don't go looking for it on the HAPI website, but that is absolutely on our roadmap for this year, is to get it to a point where we're going to add it to the main repo. We're still trying to figure out exactly what form that should take because it's not a part of FHIR, so we're deciding on what to do about that, but we will get there. And I will say one final point there, there's a whole bunch of interesting discussion coming out of the IPS community about this concept of patients curating their own IPS. And this too is incredibly contentious, more so even than the resource ID thing I talked about before. Just because, as you can imagine, as a patient yourself, you probably, if you're going to bring this thing with you for international travel, you probably do want some say as to what's actually included in there. Maybe you're going to a country where you're not comfortable with them knowing every last detail and you want to filter some out. Like that feels like a thing that people might want. On the other hand, there is, a very valid argument to be made that if a doctor can't trust that this document was sort of signed and written by another doctor, maybe they're not going to trust the document at all. So we need some mechanism to be allowed, for effectively non-repudiation of these documents. And those two goals are, I'm not going to say they're incompatible, but they're hard to rectify. So I don't know. We're still sort of talking about that, and ultimately what role HAPI FHIR can play in providing technical solutions to those problems. And there we go. I rang the bell exactly. Thank you for that. I've got loads of time, I think, for questions.
So if I'd like to customize the document that's output from, let's say, the HAPI JPA server, what options do I have? And the context here is, for example, in India, there is a spec which does not use IPS, but then they expect documents to be output based on FHIR resources.
Oh, fun. Okay. Well, so I guess I'll say this. The IPS generator is, its default configuration very much assumes you're building an IPS, but there is no requirement that you use the default configuration, actually. And truthfully, I haven't seen anyone trying to use this code base for generating non-IPS documents, but there's nothing in there that would prevent you from doing that. Like if the thing that you want to do is create a document with a bunch of sections where each section contains a bunch of data that you've sourced from somewhere, be it a repository or some other source of information, I do think this API would do exactly that. Like, it is designed to be incredibly flexible. You could create an IPS document where you remove all of the sections entirely and create your own set of sections. At that point, you're no longer generating an IPS, of course, but you are generating a document, which I think is your question. So I guess I'd say I'd love to talk to you about this use case, because I think it should be possible.
Is the FHIR mapping language of any use?
Oh, interesting. So So the question, oh yeah, thank you. So the question is the FHIR mapping language of any use here? And I will say, we don't use it anywhere in this tool chain. I mean, there is an open source HAPI implementation of the FHIR mapping language. I have to say that's another contentious. Everyone's got opinions on everything. I'm not personally a huge fan of the FHIR mapping language, so I don't tend to use it in anything I build, but that's not to trash the FHIR mapping language. I know a lot of people love it and get great value out of it, so there we go. But no, we haven't used it for this. Sure.
Hi, James. I'm Hendrik from Germany, and I have a question regarding the attester. In Germany, the signature is a big deal, and unless the data is not signed with blood, it's untrusted. So how do you deal with the attester and that the data is, the integrity is, yeah.
Oh, I love it. So I guess I'll say that is, I thought about adding another bullet about it to this very last slide, and I decided not to because I didn't want to get into digital signatures, but now you're forcing me to, so I will. There is no support for that in the IPS generator today, nor does HAPI have anything at this moment for doing any kind of digital signatures on FHIR payloads. Not to say we won't. I actually think we really have to. Kind of the implicit part of, I think, that third bullet, though, is, this is the place where we really need to come up with a bit of consensus within the broader IPS, and I guess really the broader FHIR documents sort of community about how this stuff should work. The reason that this is hard, of course, is that once you've digitally signed something, it physically, you can't change it anymore, of course, because that invalidates the digital signature. And yet there are people with these use cases where they want to be able to annotate or, remove or any of those things. So I don't know, I guess I'm sort of personally just trying to watch and participate in that discussion to get us to a point where we have something everyone agrees on so that we can start implementing the software for it. I know I'm totally not answering your question because you've probably got problems you want to solve today, and all I'm saying is we don't have a solution yet, but those are the concerns at least. I think we've got one right at the back.
So thinking about your last part of the talk, is the IPS evolving to a point where, besides the travel use case, can it be used as like a personal single document of the entire, not entire health history, but the core health history that individuals decide to keep for themselves or use it?
So I got to say two things. A, I think I'm the wrong person to ask, and I would definitely say, Rob is going to do a talk. When is your talk, Rob? Do you know?
It's tomorrow.
It's
right afternoon.
Got it. Okay, so Rob Housen will be doing a talk right after noon tomorrow, and he's a better person to ask that question to. I will say, just because I'm not a clinician and I'm not the person who I think should have an opinion on what data is appropriate to include. I just want to create APIs that would allow people to include whatever they've decided is appropriate to put into the IPS document. So that's the part I like to talk about. I will say though, I've seen a bunch of debate out there. There are people who feel that the IPS document should include everything you possibly know about a patient. There are people who feel that way. There are other people that point out that the S stands for summary, and if you include everything, you really don't have a summary anymore. And I think that's a valid argument. It tends to hold weight with me, personally. I guess the only other thing I'll say is there are some fascinating use cases beyond unplanned care, just because you were talking about that. One that I just keep thinking about because I think it's so neat I was talking to a group last year who were interested in ambulances that were racing towards a hospital with a patient in the back. And they were sort of looking at, could we have the hospital send an IPS to the ambulance with all the pertinent information that the paramedics on the ambulance might want to know? And conversely, could the ambulance software be, like the EMS software, be sending up a little mini IPS back to the hospital that is like, here's everything we know about the patient right now. Here's their vitals, here's what we think is going on, which I thought was really neat. And truthfully, I haven't heard any more about that project in the last year, but it sounded very cool to me. Sure. Well, this is the other funny thing I think about IPS is that ultimately it is the first FHIR document format that's getting any traction. And I think all of a sudden, I was talking about wildly inappropriate use cases, and I'm not saying that's an inappropriate use case, of course, but I think people are looking at this and thinking, hey, could we do transition of care? Could we, do emergency discharge summaries? There's all these other things that call for documents, and we've now got a really nice document format in FHIR. So, who knows where we go? I'm going to say ask that one to Rob tomorrow too, because I bet he's got a better answer than me. Or maybe
Okay,
he's-
one final question we have time for.
So the Smart Health Links implementation is going to be open sourced. Is there a dependency on HAPI, or is that standalone as well, or?
So that, truthfully, that's why we haven't open sourced it yet, is because we're trying to decide those little basic things. Like, are we going to allow this thing to work outside of, it's not allow, it's more like, it's a little bit easier for us if we roll it all into one library, but that's also kind of limiting. So we're sort of deciding, like, how do we want to answer those questions? I'm going to say it probably is going to sit inside HAPI and will require a running HAPI server, but that doesn't mean you'd have to have any other data in your repository. Like, that's probably the way we're going to end up going, because it's kind of manageable that way.
I'm excited by the standalone version of the generator, so yeah.
Awesome. Me too.
Great, so thank you.
One quick update is Rob's talk is at 10:15 tomorrow.
Oh.
So not early afternoon.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so if anyone didn't hear that, Rob is at 10:15 tomorrow. Thank you. Come and ask him your hardest IPS questions.
Well, thank you, James, so much for that. That was all we had time for. But of course, James is approachable. So if you have any more questions, go to him. And he will not have any rest the rest of the Dev Days. Thank you.
Thank you all.